to talk about kind of different dangerous management styles. Um, like, we all heard perhaps about like the firefighting wolf or the rhino that chases the next like shiny opportunity, or perhaps the seagull, which if you didn't hear about like seagull management, I highly recommend that you would, after this talk, Google it. It's hilarious. Um, so um, let's perhaps look at hippos. Like, did anyone hear about hippo? Um, well, hippo is kind of the acronym of the highest paid person's opinion. And the idea is that in companies where we don't speak to our clients, where we don't talk to our users, usually it is the highest paid person's opinion that dictates what needs to happen next, right? Um, these organizations usually believe they know what their users want and what their customers want. So there's no point in kind of going out and talking to them and making sure. What you end up having is like a long backlog with different features upon features. And to some extent, like some of them, you don't even know how they ended up there or what value they provide. Does that sound familiar? Like, does anybody recall working for such a company where, you know, you didn't have direct contact with your users or customers? It was the sound of raising a hand. So I would assume the answer is yes, because the latest survey I've seen, we're talking in 2023, 58% of the companies don't measure the impact of their user experience. Now, as soon as companies grow and become bigger, one thing that usually happens is that they become kind of more data-driven. There is the famous quote of Peter Drucker, "You can't improve what you don't measure," which is, of course, true. But in most cases, what ends up happening is the companies really focus on the low-hanging fruits, and they're measuring things that are available. Like they would measure conversion rate or time on task or success rates. And these are all good measures, right? There's nothing wrong with them. But it's not perfect. Like, I'm going to present a chart and, maybe you can reply with thumbs up or thumbs down. Like, does anyone know this chart? On one axis, we have like behavioral, on the other, attitudinal. On one side, we have quantitative, qualitative. Can anyone guess where, click-through rate or time on task, success rate, where they all fit in? If anybody wants to like raise their hand and perhaps take that as, an answer. Well, I'll say the trouble. They are all behavioral quantitative data items. Now, this doesn't mean that it is wrong. If it was a fight between a hippo or using behavioral quantitative data, of course, it's much better. But I want to talk today about perhaps how to make this even better. Now, the problem usually that data-driven companies face is kind of complex. The idea of data-driven companies, they would usually work in increments, and you're really devoting all your time and effort to small incremental changes, which is kind of slowly improving your product and testing, things as you go along, which is, of course, a great way to go. But it usually has a tendency to focus on the short term instead of the long term value that you can provide. Now, when the companies grow, they end up implementing a lot of different systems to measure results. And eventually these systems will conflict with each other. Like, and then which one would you trust? Is it the Google Analytics, or maybe it's dating amplitude or optimize, or what is your single source of truth? And the problem with just using quantitative data is that it shows you what people do. It doesn't really show you why people do why people do the things they do, right? You know what is happening, but not why. And what you end up measuring is what you have and not what you want and what is valuable. I usually like to use a concrete example to really try and make it more obvious. So if we are looking at, for example, a website where our revenue is from ads, right? And you have 10 sessions, and 9 of these sessions didn't see an ad, right? So the revenue for those sessions is 0. And 1 session has seen 10 ads. So if you would look at the percentage of sessions that convert, and that would be how you're counting your conversions, then you end up having 10% because only 1 of those sessions actually saw ads. But if you would look at the total conversions divided with the total sessions, you would end up having 100% conversion. So just by changing the way that we're manipulating the data, you can have really drastically different results. And this is visible as well if you are changing the scope of the data. So for example, this is an e-commerce site. And if we would look at the general conversion rates, the numbers that are really small, it is not intended really for people to get deep into them, but the general conversion rate would be 58%. But if we're looking at people that converted from the product page, people that actually found the product that they're interested in and converted, we're getting a different result. All of a sudden, we're looking at 62.4% of the people that converted. Now, we are just talking in this way about kind of more the KPIs or the health matrix that these organizations would use to measure, are we on the right track? Where are we? But another thing that these companies tend to do is to use experiments, right? Did anyone hear about A/B testing or have experience with A/B testing here? Great. I see a thumbs up and a thumbs up. Everybody loves A/B tests, right? They're awesome. Until they're not. A/B tests actually are better than not doing testing, but they are limited, right? I will just give a tiny crash course into how A/B testing works. Now, you would have 2 systems, and you would compare version A and version B. Well, version A would be kind of how things are, and version B would be a small tweak or an iteration that you're trying to see have we improved things or didn't. Then you would have a testing platform, which would route traffic to both versions A and B. And the idea is that this system is totally oblivious to what it does. It just sends 1 session to A, 1 session to B, another session to A, another session to B. And over time, you're collecting the data from these sessions, and eventually, hopefully, you're reaching a meaningful result, right? You think, okay, I improved conversions on version B, so that would be the version that should win. But there is a catch. I think the catch is kind of easier to explain if we're looking at a real world example. Now, if we're talking about e-commerce, then let's talk about a real brick and mortar shop. And imagine that you're the store owner. You have a shop, people go in, they buy stuff, and you're looking for ways to make people buy more stuff. Then you come up with a brilliant idea. You're thinking, oh, I know, if I will put a guy with a gun in the cash register that would basically threaten everybody and say, buy more, people will buy more, right? And you're thinking, how can I test it? And you're setting up an experiment where you have 1 cash register with the guy with the gun and the other cash register, which is totally normal. And then you're seeing like, oh, shocking results. The people that have the guns to their head bought more. Does that mean that these people would actually come back to the store though? Does that mean that it was a better experience? Now, here's a really interesting thing to consider. The platform for testing would just fill both of these buckets with new sessions. You will not test for retention and you will not know how many people you lost because they're outside of your testing cycle. And usually A/B tests are run for 2-week intervals. That's kind of the classic one, right? That's not enough to test retention on products that you're not using daily. So A/B tests fail in several different ways, right? You might be looking at the wrong variables. You didn't push the variable you were looking at, but you pushed another variable. Maybe you didn't run the experiment for long enough. Maybe the sample sizes are too small. The limited tooling is another thing that, we can discuss for hours, but I'm not going to go into that. But the thing is that A/B tests are today limited. And experiences matter more than conversions. So now let's take a sidetrack and, let's go back in time. Things were always better, right? So like the road to better decision-making actually goes back to the 80s. We're talking at a dissertation from MIT in collaboration with IBM that tried to predict the adaptation of new technology. And the idea is that companies wanted to know what is their chances of getting a return on investment if they do A or B or C or whatnot. Now, putting it in simpler terms, like, is something worth investing in? They came to like the shocking discovery, right? If something is useful, so it does something that you actually want it to do, it helps you reach your goals, and it is easy enough to use. So basically, it's saving you time or effort in doing something that you want. It will be adopted and most likely would be a good investment. Of course, in this case, we're not looking at factors like cost and things like that, but just generally speaking, will it be a good investment? And at that time, this model is limited because there is no definition for what usability is. It's just a model. There is no standard questionnaire. But a couple of years later, they come up with like the first, usability questionnaire, which is really just a quick and dirty way of measuring usability in different systems. And I don't know if anybody used SUS, but please don't. It is really like not the way to go today. The thing is that a couple of, or several, 12 years later, to be exact, we actually come up with a standard definition for usability. And the standard definition for usability is out of the mix, which goes back to like efficiency, effectiveness, and satisfaction. So now we know how to measure usability. We have a standard definition of what it is. And we kind of just need somebody to figure out how to make this questionnaire something which is usable. So in 2010, there is the first questionnaire. Instant. And his colleagues at Intel developed the ULUX, which is a standard questionnaire with 4 questions, basically stripping out the negative questions you had in the SUS and looking at only positive ones using kind of a Likert scale between totally agree and totally disagree to see if the system it can be considered usable, right? Now we're going to something which is a bit more useful for us. Nobody would fill in a form with 10 questions. 4 questions is a bit more realistic. But somebody 3 years later thought, well, I can do better, right? And they trimmed it down to really focusing on 2 questions that are at the core of the technology acceptance model, which is, does it do what I need it to do? And is it easy enough to use? That model, or that questionnaire, was further developed to an even lighter version, which included more clear wording and a smaller scale. Now, if you want to nerd out on Likert scales and what point system to use, and you're a person like me, I really recommend measuring you and really looking into all the nerdy debates about what system should you use. But what you should know is that, you can actually get a really good vibe if you are doing the right thing just by posing 2 questions and putting them on a 5-point scale. And then the guys at the top were like, well, what about making things pretty? Like, shouldn't we perhaps account for that? And they developed a questionnaire that actually accounts for both, the usability, the usefulness, and the aesthetics of things. And the cool thing about this is that all these values end up being, they end up resulting in one figure that gives you a really good value to, are we more, are we doing better, are we doing worse? And you can actually compare yourself to other products in the market or to use that in different sections of the site. Now, that was a lot, right? That was kind of like a short history lesson, and I'm really apologizing. I probably missed everybody here, but hopefully everybody survived. The important thing to note is that everything leads back to the technology acceptance model. If something is useful enough and easy enough to use, it will be used. So experiences are quantifiable. You can actually quantify experiences, which is an attitudinal, qualitative piece of information, and compare it or use it as part of your testing and experimentation. So now that the interesting part is collecting data, and we just talked about why it's not that difficult, there is usually the question like, okay, great, so how do we begin? And the answer is, well, intercept surveys. There's plenty of platforms out there that offer intercept surveys that you can post to users while they're using your service to further improve it and to get the feedback that you need. In most cases, you don't need any infrastructure, but even if you decide to develop it on your own, it's 2 hard-coded questions. You can actually make that survey in like 2 hours and connect it with a database. So the next challenge is like, okay, but when do we actually collect this data? Now, I don't know, did anyone see this type of thing? Yeah. This device or machine is kind of a customer satisfaction collection device, right? Stores use it today, even buses or like public municipalities. And the idea is to try and quantify the experience on a physical world. Now, these devices, I'm not saying we should use them, but where are they located?
No.
Yeah, the door.
At the end of the experience.
Sorry?
At the end of the experience.
Exactly. They're actually on the way out. You have already experienced something, and then as soon as possible, they're asking you, can you rate your experience? And this is kind of the same thing that you're going to find in a digital world. As soon as the journey ends, I would recommend posing a question. Now, the really cool thing about using, for example, UX Lite is the fact that these are 2 separate questions. You don't need to ask usefulness and usability in the same questionnaire. You can, but you don't have to force people to fill in 2 questions in order for the input to be valid. So, great. Experiences are quantifiable, they're cheap, they're easy, they would lead to like better decisions, and they can be automated. Why is this awesome? Well, I don't know. I personally am perhaps more enthusiastic about it than the regular individual, but I think this is really, really powerful. Like, you can actually measure how you are performing over time. You can look at either a product or a company level or even individual, let's call it jobs to be done, and how you're performing on those jobs to be done over time, and get a meaningful, let's call it, number that you can follow. Why is it also awesome? Well, because instead of just looking at conversions, you can really look into how people experienced during the A/B test. What version provided you with a better experience? And as we agreed before, like, an experience is probably a better indicator of future performance than conversions. So we just managed to make A/B tests meaningful. So what I want people to really take from this is not about using a specific metric, like I am voting for UX slide or app score or whatnot. It is really about trying to challenge yourself and complementing the quantitative data you're already collecting with customer input. And that's it. Thank you for listening. Yay. Now, I would like to see if anybody has any questions or anything you are wondering. Any questions from the audience?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So you might use A/B testing to see if the user likes to go this way or that way, which is more better than the other way. And you can use the checkout points to see if were they happy or not during the whole process. But what is the best way to figure out what they actually want? Because if you see the points go down, you still don't have a clue why they're going down. And the A/B testing just tells you that A is better than B. But what is C and D and E and F? So what's your ideas around that? How do you really figure out what they want?
Well, it's usually very, there is no one right answer other than talking to people. Like I don't understand my wife. If I would ask her, like, is everything fine? She would probably say like, no, yes. On the other hand, if I would ask her, what do you want me to do? She would be like very eager to give me a list of to-dos for the day. And the thing is that users would gladly provide input to how you can make their experience better. The idea of just looking at quantitative data, if you're rightfully saying, right, and trying to decipher what is the right move, it's not the right approach. You have to really go out and talk to people and conduct this type of like two-way communication in order to discover what people really want and why people are actually doing things. So you have to complement your quantitative data with qualitative data. But the idea is that even when you are looking at A/B tests, you would be able to get a glimmer of what experience was better, which is a much more valuable input than where was the conversion rate higher.
So you see many companies use this type of community where you post a suggestion and then everybody else can vote on them. Have you seen or heard if that actually works? Actually is good, or does it end up with other issues?
Well, everything is a balance of like both positives and negatives, and everything would have like pros and cons. But having the type of community board and voting on features better than like a lot of other ways of communicating with customers. One concrete example I can give you is Figma, that was using it for more or less what feature should we develop next, and allowing people to provide inputs. So it does work. And in the same way, if you would look at Stack Overflow and Stack Exchange, where you can rate people's answers, and perhaps we're not talking features, but rate people's answers, is a really nice way of prioritizing input. I have seen some chat comments. Yes, but totally agree. Yeah, always complement qualitative and quantitative data. Do we have any more questions? Yeah, Ellen.
I have one, Sam. You mentioned in the presentation there was some resources that you love nerding out over.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could just say what those are again, because I didn't quite catch them.
Well, generally speaking, anything that Measuring You published is really good. They have Jeff Solo and James Lewis. Both of them are really incredible in the work that they did, and they spend decades studying how to quantify both different scales and different aspects of user experience. So if you want to nerd out on something and you have a couple of months to kill, it's well worth the time. Any other questions? No. Okay. I will then just perhaps like to end early, so everybody would have the chance to go ahead and eat, right? And I would ask two questions. Was the information you heard today useful? Good. I see loads of thumbs up and like confetti and joy. Okay. And then the next question would be like, is it something that you find useful? Great. So without further ado, thank you very much for today.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you everyone who attended. I'll be following up via email.
Thank you, Samuel.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. This was really informative. Thank you so much.
We're done.